China has become a world power in all aspects, and with that, a major financier and lender to many countries, both advanced and developing ones. The nature of China's relationship with the African continent has come under the spotlight in the past several years due to the loans it gives and now the amount of debt African countries owe it. But China has now offered to give some sort of relief. We'll get into the announcement some are calling a good move and others are labeling as political optics. I have the authors of Boston University's Global Development Policy Center reports into this issue joining me. And from there, we head to South Africa, where the country's electricity firm Eskom is back in the news. Load shedding has reached stage 5 and in some instances, stage 6. An energy expert joins me today to get into this. This is Business Edge. I'm Tolilokwe Adeleru Balogun. When China announced in August of this year that it would completely clear 23 interest-free loans maturing in 2021 for 17 African countries, collective sighs of relief were heard around the continent. According to the IMF, 7 African countries, Chad, Congo Republic, Mozambique, Somalia, South Sudan, Sudan, and Zimbabwe are in debt distress, and 14 others are headed in that direction. Debt relief and restructuring are high on the continent's agenda, but there have been questions. Who are the 17 countries getting these waivers? How much are the 23 loans worth? And will this make an impact for these countries? A report by the Global China Initiative at the Boston University Global Development Center has tried to answer some of these questions. The university has been tracking China's loans to Africa since 2000. I have joining me Tyrella Moses, data analyst and database manager for the Global China Initiative from Boston University, as well as Zhangzhuang Wan. She's a Global China pre-doctoral research fellow at the Boston University Global Development Policy Center. And the two ladies are the authors of that report. So we'll get straight into it. Tyrella and Zhangzhuang, thank you so much for joining me on Business Edge.
Thank you so much for having us, Tolulope. All right. It's great to be here.
So, Tyrella, let me start with you. This database has been tracking the loans coming from about 2000, but the relationship goes back a little bit before that. So from the 1960s to about the 1990s, China wasn't really known for doing much business with or in the African continent. But that changed from the 1990s onward. And then between 2000 and 2020, China's involvement in business on the continent has skyrocketed. The Chinese Loans to Africa Center says from 2000 to 2019, Chinese financiers signed over 1,000 loan commitments to African countries. So, Tyrella, let's start there. What do you think has prompted this sort of change in engagement with China to the African continent?
Yes, so our Chinese Loans to Africa database, as you mentioned, has been tracking Chinese loans to Africa from 2000 to 2020. And what we have found is that China and Chinese creditors specifically have provided 1,188 loan commitments to African governments that amount to about 160 billion over the course of these years. So the rise of a lot of these Chinese loans really started in the 1990s with China's going out policy, in which the government was seeking to support the internationalization of Chinese companies throughout the world. And there are many reasons for why this desire for internationalization was present. And that's because there was overcapacity in certain industries in which companies were seeking to capture more markets and also get more business due to too much production domestically. And there was also the instance of China joining the WTO as well, which gave opportunities for Chinese companies to become more competitive on the international market. So with that being said, you do see this rise in 1990s, and then you see it again after 2013, which was the announcement of the Belt and Road Initiative, which really galvanized an even more of an increase in Chinese lending all around the world as companies felt more supported by their government, and especially Chinese policy banks and other other domestic commercial banks as well, were supporting these institutions as they sought markets elsewhere.
Okay, so that gives us a bit of a foundation in terms of this conversation and China's engagement. Zhajong, let me come to you now. Some of the criticisms we've heard of the Chinese loan sort of system in Africa is how sophisticated and also how opaque it is. In looking into this, we see that China has some very sophisticated contract terms to manage high-risk borrowers, which happen to be what a number of African countries are. So we have things like keeping contract terms undisclosed unless otherwise required by local law, maintaining an escrow account and other special bank accounts to secure debt payments, excluding debts from restructuring in the Paris Club of Official Bilateral Creditors and other collective restructuring initiatives, also allowing the lender to terminate the agreement, even demanding immediate full repayment if the borrower defaults on other lenders. So these terms are some of the things that have come under fire when it comes to how China is actually loaning money to the African continent. Do you think the criticisms are deserved?
So Chinese creditors act in their own interest, which is ultimately to receive cash or in-kind payment that is agreed upon ahead of time. Now, they often use instruments that are common practice within international finance, such as escrow accounts, or practices based on their own experience with infrastructure lending, such as resource-backed loans. Now, there are mounting criticism based on these practices, but it is natural that a creditor or a country acts in its own interest. Now, when it comes to transparency, that is an issue because the lack of transparency has led to a lot of estimates and speculation about the true nature of Chinese lending. So it would be beneficial to have more transparency. Since transparency is required by local law, host country governments, the borrowers, can do more to make these lending agreements more transparent. We've seen calls for more transparency from the public in Kenya and Nigeria, for example, which shows that it is in the public's interest to make adjustments to these non-transparent practices.
All right, so let me stay with you. Let's pick it up a bit now. So the reason we're having this conversation is that just a few weeks ago, China offered to waive 23 interest-free loans that matured in late 2021 for some 17 African countries. And we just talked about transparency and the opaque nature around the Chinese loans. And right now, we don't know which 17 African countries officially are going to be on that list. We're not even quite sure about the nature of these 23 interest-free loans as well. So let's look into this. How many of the loans that we are aware of granted to Africa fall into this interest-free loan category? So what's available to actually be canceled?
So of the 1,188 loans in the Chinese Loans to Africa database signed between 2000 and 2020, 18% of them, or 212 of them, are interest-free loans. So currently there are 2.2 billion worth of interest-free loans in our database. Now, even if all of them were canceled, it would still amount to only 1% of the 160 billion of Chinese loans to Africa committed between 2000 and 2020. So historically, interest-free loans are not bank loans, right? These are loans offered formerly by the Ministry of Commerce and now jointly by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So the involvement of Ministry of Foreign Affairs points to that these interest-free loans have a diplomatic purpose to it. So we need to be careful when we think about what are Chinese bank loans and what are interest-free loans. These are different loans by nature.
Okay, so different loans by nature, some 1,000 and so that might be possibly up for maybe grabs in this kind of conversation. So Tyrella, when we look at these debts, we see a lot of pressure coming from the West, and we'll get into that later in this conversation. When we look at these debts, the majority of the debts are owed by 5 countries, and those are Angola, Ethiopia, Kenya, Nigeria, and Zambia. But these are supposed to be 17 countries that will benefit from this waiver that China is offering. So if you had to hazard a guess, again, referencing the fact that there is some lack of transparency in this whole situation, who would you think are the African countries in line to benefit from this interest-free loan, their interest-free loans being canceled?
We took some time to estimate forgiveness through 4 approaches. Specifically. And in our second approach, we looked at African countries that have signed interest-free loan agreements from 2000 to 2012, which gives us up to a 2021 maturity, which was included in this recent announcement. And then we looked at that group and specifically looked at African participants of the debt service suspension initiative that have also received debt repayment deferrals from China. Because when we looked at this group, we knew that China has historically forgiven overdue interest-free loans for countries in higher risk or present debt distress. And in the past, China has forgiven interest-free loans that are overdue for least developed countries, heavily indebted poor countries, and small island developing countries in Africa. So when we specifically looked at this group of African countries that have signed an interest-free loan from 2000 to 2012, and that also participated in the debt service suspension initiative and received a debt deferral from China, we found 16 African countries that could potentially be a part of this 17 number. And these countries include Angola, Burundi, Cabo Verde, Cameroon, the Democratic Republic of Congo, the Republic of Congo, Ethiopia, Guinea, Lesotho, Mauritania, Mozambique, Senegal, Tanzania, Togo, Uganda, and Zambia.
And so 16 countries. So do we think all of those countries are the ones who likely will get this waiver, Tarela?
We believe that these are some of the potential countries that could be in this 17, yes.
All right. Zhejiang, I want to come back to you. So you talked a bit about the number of the interest-free loans that are basically that you have access to and you've been able to keep up with on the database. But in real terms, for many of these African countries, the 16 that Tarela mentioned, what would this cancellation of the interest-free loans actually amount to? What difference can it even make for the countries that could be potentially on the list to get it?
So as Tarela explained, depending on who we think might be among the 17 countries and which of the 23 interest-free loans are involved, now there are 4 different ways we can estimate how much this might be. After all, some countries might be more in need of cancellation, as listed above, and some interest-free loans may have already been canceled in previous announcements. So by adjusting these 2 criteria, the amount canceled could be anywhere from $45 million to $610 million. The average across these 4 estimations is around 200 to 300 million. Now, this might sound like a wide range, but it is in fact quite narrow given that the total loan commitment in our database is 160. As for impact to individual countries, it really depends on which countries are involved. It may not be a lot for major borrowers like Kenya or the Democratic Republic of the Congo, but it will be significant amounts for smaller borrowers like Lesotho.
Okay, so let's move further on this because, again, as I said earlier, there's a larger conversation on how much the continent owes to China, and then this conversation on the debt trap diplomacy that might also be involved. But fundamentally, when you look at this decision, it does go just a little, not too far, not even enough in many people's estimation to actually alter Africa's indebtedness. And on the other hand, you have something like the G20 debt service suspension initiative. But we also see that China has deferred the largest amount of debt repayments of all G20 countries by suspending about $1.35 billion in debt repayment for 23 countries. I think the expectation is China should, maybe let me use the word, be more responsible or be more cautious in how it engages African countries, given some of the desperation we've seen. So I'm going to ask the two of you this question. Tarela, let me start with you. What should be expected of China when it comes to issues around Africa's indebtedness?
Important to understand that historically China has approached indebtedness and debt relief in multiple approaches. China has frequently, as we've been talking about today, forgiven overdue interest-free loans, but Chinese creditors have also provided debt restructuring, debt deferrals, and debt reprofiling as well. So when it comes to African indebtedness, China has been showing that it's willing to work with countries to address these issues through these different types of debt relief avenues. And I think each of these are also based on Chinese creditors' specific assessments of countries' debt profiles as well. But I think we need to think about some 3 main points when it comes to Chinese creditors. The first is that Chinese creditors do not act as one monolithic institution. Each creditor has their own approach to debt management and restructuring processes. So it is challenging for China to coordinate all these creditors. Two, Chinese creditors, like any other creditors, want to be repaid and would prefer not to take losses on these loans. And then lastly, three, research has shown that there is no evidence for this concept of Chinese debt trap diplomacy specifically. Research on cases in Kenya related to the Mombasa port, Nigeria related to the national ICT backbone, and even Uganda related to the Entebbe International Airport show that China has not seized any assets in the event of non-repayment. So I think these three main points are important to keep in mind as we're talking about Chinese creditors and their approach to African indebtedness.
All right, Zhizhong, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I think Tarilla covered all of it.
All right, so then let me bring the next question to you, because also there's a trend I think African countries do need to take a bit of cognizance of, given the need that many have in terms of looking for financing. What we've seen is that while China continues to provide the largest volume of loans bilaterally to the continent, the nature of that is also changing. The Belt and Road Initiative of 2013 was actually when the annual lending commitments of China peaked. And now we've seen a bit of a decline over the past several years, particularly between 2018 to 2019. There was a decline of 30% from $9.9 billion to $7 billion. So is this a structural decline, or is it maybe just something that is around the nature of how rebalancing comes about when it comes to Chinese lending to Africa? Or are we seeing a change in engagement?
So Chinese lending is driven by Chinese business and strategic interests. The primary mandate of major Chinese lenders to Africa, such as the China Export-Import Bank or the China Development Bank, is to serve the Chinese economy and business interests. So when risks are high, such as during the 2008 global financial crisis or during this pandemic, lending decreased. When strategic interests are at hand, however, such as when a major oil exporting partner like Angola faced defaults due to the commodity price shock, China redoubled its lending to prevent Angola from going into default. So it is important to note that the decrease in Chinese loan commitments to Africa since 2016 is mirrored by decreases to Chinese loans in Latin America as well, with more cautious lending to more controversial projects such as coal power plants. So the decrease in Chinese lending to Africa is not unique. It is also occurring elsewhere. So without structural changes to borrowing practices from the African side and lending standards from the Chinese side, we are unlikely to see loan commitments bounce back to its previous high. However, we may see other forms of financing, such as foreign direct investments, which remain comparatively stable over the same period, to take on a more prominent role.
All right, so I'll ask you my final question to you before I wrap things up. You've, of course, talked about maybe structural changes on the African side and also changes on the borrowing side as well. But a lot of the conversation stems from the fact that African countries need money and they're heading outside. They're not able to fully finance their budgets, fully finance infrastructural projects, with the continent's infrastructural deficit being so large. What alternatives do African countries have? We've seen what's been happening on the Eurobond market. We've seen what's been happening with government bonds across the continent. It's a difficult position to be in, but you have to pay salaries. You have to finance projects. You need to put that money there. So what options are left for African countries?
So public-private partnerships or attracting equity investment from companies around the world is one way African countries can meet their financing needs. But governments have to be more comfortable with the extent to which equity requires management and ownership. It is not as simple as loan. Now, borrowing or seeking guarantees from regional institutions such as the African Development Bank or the African Export-Import Bank is another option. Now, these institutions have a more focused mission and understanding of how to support African countries' financial needs, especially when it comes to infrastructure. So we think these are plausible ways for Africans to meet their financing needs moving forward, even as loans decrease.
All right, and Tarella, the last question in this conversation. No doubt African debt is in the global spotlight. It's not going to go away for a long time because of the needs of the continent. We have the IMF estimating that at the end of 2019, the total debt of sub-Saharan African governments amounted to close to $1 trillion, and that was more than 60% of the region's GDP. And this resurgence of anxiety over African debts is something that we need to take cognizance of. There are countries and economies at the line of debt distress, and many are following to get to that line. When we see these conversations, the overwhelming focus happens to be on China. As you mentioned earlier, maybe there really isn't that much to the debt diplomacy or debt trap diplomacy conversation, but this overwhelming focus seems to be on China. Do you think that should be how we are viewing things? Is China possibly the only culprit in Africa's indebtedness?
Yeah, so when it comes to pointing fingers in the issue of African debt, I think this is a problem because both lenders and borrowers should bear responsibilities. So on the lender side of things, we have seen recently that research from the UK-based NGO Debt Justice shows that African governments actually owe more to private creditors and private creditors in the sense of Western banks, asset managers, and oil traders. You mentioned Eurobonds as well. And they owe more to private creditors than they do to Chinese lenders. And then in that report, there were also other Western official public creditors that are also in the mix. But for each country, when you're assessing debt profiles, this creditor mix and level of debt changes. Therefore, debt owed should come down to a country-specific level when we're analyzing African indebtedness specifically. And borrowing country and creditor should all be involved in addressing debt issues. So I say all this to say that both lenders and borrowers have responsibilities when it comes to debt and even debt to African governments specifically. All lenders, including private creditors, should be at the table to address the issue of sovereign lending. And I think borrowers could also do more to reassess other ways of borrowing sustainably, or as Jijong mentioned, seeking other avenues of finance to address fiscal deficits for public goods.
All right, it is a conversation I don't think is going to end today. Thank you so much, ladies, for joining us. And of course, the conversation continues. And when we can, we'll be reaching back out to you for more.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you very much. And the ladies joining me from Boston University, I had Terilla Moses and Jijong Wang from the Boston University Global Development Policy Center, the authors of a report looking into just how much is China's offer of waiving 23 interest-free loans for 17 African countries worth. And the estimate goes from anywhere from about $45 to about $650 million, with the average expectation being about 200. But if you notice my words, average, expectation, estimation, because it's still very opaque. Who are those 17 countries and which of the 23 loans are actually going to be involved? We still don't have answers to that. But when we do, we'll continue this conversation. You're watching Business Edge. When we come back, there is much more for you on the show.
Now, the International Energy Agency has called for a global end to the sale of new petrol and diesel cars by the year 2035, as it argued a massive scaling up of investment in clean energy is needed to boost energy security. The intergovernmental group of mostly wealthy Western countries, including the UK and the US, said progress on cutting emissions from road vehicles falls short of what is needed to tackle climate change. Electric cars accounted for just over 1% of all cars on the road in 2021, and the IEA says this needs to rise to between 20 and 25% by the year 2030 to put the world on course for climate targets. Moving on now, Norway's $1.2 trillion sovereign wealth fund will require the companies it invests in to reach net zero emissions by the year 2050 at the latest, joining many global investors in setting such goals to prevent the financial risks from a delayed transition. Just 10% of companies in the wealth fund's portfolio have a net zero target for 2050, while just around that number have taken steps toward emission targets. The fund said it will push for companies to reach the goal via credible interim targets and plans. Oil prices steadied on Tuesday after rising in the previous session on concerns that further U.S. interest rate hikes this week to tame inflation will curb economic growth and fuel demand in the world's biggest oil consumer. Brent crude futures for November settlement rose to $92.03 a barrel, while U.S. WTI crude for October delivery was $85.76 a barrel. The October contracts will expire on Tuesday. Meanwhile, the dollar remained firm below a two-decade high versus major peers on Tuesday ahead of a slew of central bank meetings around the World Bank this week, led by the U.S. Federal Reserve, which is likely to raise interest rates by another 75 basis points to rein in inflation. Iron ore rose after Chinese economic indicators suggested that government stimulus is boosting the aiding construction industry, which should flow through to stronger demand for the steelmaking material. Higher steel output and falling rebar inventories are signaling Beijing's bid to stimulate construction after an almost year-long property slump is having a positive impact. Daily steel output edged up 3.3% in the first 10 days of September compared with the end of August, while new investments are fueling building activity. And finally, the fanfare over a revamp of the Ethereum blockchain is still echoing across the cryptoverse, but that is doing little to stem a slide in Ether. The network's native token is down 10% since the most commercially important digital ledger last week implemented an upgrade to slash energy use. The second largest virtual coin had rallied from mid-June on hype around the software update known as Merge. However, it is down by some 63% this year, a bruising period of cryptocurrencies. And those are the international business stories that we have for you. In our next conversation, we'll be talking about Eskom and South Africa's load shedding crisis. We'll be back with that story.